Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you on this Tuesday morning. It is Tuesday, September 15th, and it is a beautiful morning. 70 degrees outside this morning, and another day in God's creation. The sun was not as shaded by the dust this morning, so I think the dust is going away, or the smoke, or whatever it is, that plume. I read yesterday that plume from the California wildfires are going all the way to New York. Can you believe that? That is a long distance. Can't imagine how difficult it must be to be in those wildfires. Anyway, so we'll keep them in our prayers, and it is a beautiful day in God's creation. And let's see, what else? There is a birthday today. The birthday on September 15th is Terry Marcus. Happy birthday, Terry Marcus. Terry works on staff. She is amazing and keeps everything together. And so her birthday's today. We want her to have many, 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 many more birthdays. She's just getting started. That is my prayer today, is that she has as many birthdays ahead of her as she's had behind her. That would be wonderful. Let's see, what else can I say today? Still interesting kind of what's going on in the coronavirus world. I think we are, well, I don't know. I mean, it seems like when this thing goes through a country, it goes through once and it comes back down. It doesn't seem to be much of a second wave as far as deaths and hospitalizations. There might be a second wave of infections because now we're doing more testing. But as far as hospitalizations and deaths, that's way down. And part of it, I think, is due to the fact that they have a whole lot better idea of what in the world this thing is and how to treat it and what kind of things and what's treatment early and that sort of thing. And I hope everybody in the world understands that the best thing you can do in this thing is to go outside and get some vitamin D. Vitamin D is critical to fight this thing. So go outside, get some vitamin D, and enjoy God's creation, right? That's why he made creation. So you go outside and get vitamin D. I wonder how the Druids did it. Jennifer and I, when we were first married, we lived in England, and we went to a cave, a Druid cave somewhere, and toured, and they lived underground. They were like moles or, rabbits or something, and they lived underground. They just came outside periodically. They had white skin, never touched by the sun. Probably beautiful skin, because our skin's touched by the sun. But anyway, but they were a weird culture and they did bad things, and so they're no longer around. God does not like cultures that sacrifice humans. So that was taken care of with Abraham and Isaac, right? And no more will human sacrifice be acceptable in God's sight. And of course, we have the ultimate sacrifice, which is Jesus. So we don't need we don't need sacrifices of any kind. All right. I think that's it. Today we're going to talk about Tamar. It's interesting. We started into the story of Joseph, and the whole rest of Genesis is Joseph, except that for some reason Moses interjects this whole thing about Tamar. And I think it's because Joseph is sold into slavery, and so he's with the Midianites or the Ishmaelites, and he has to get all the way from Canaan down into Egypt, and that trip probably took a long time. He was 17 years old, so I'm guessing that Moses puts in a filler story to get Joseph from where he's sold into slavery over to Egypt and what happens in Egypt. So, but for whatever reason, Moses decides to share with us this story of Tamar. Now, Tamar is in the lineage of Judah. And if that name sounds familiar, one of Jacob's son is Judah, and Judah is the one that God chooses to have the lineage of Jesus Christ, of Jesus. And so, but in order to be in the lineage of Jesus, you got to have children, right? And this runs into a problem for Tamar because well, we'll have to see when we get into the story. So, let's see. Any other announcements before we get into this? I can't think of any. Oh, yes, one announcement. The We Can Do Hard Things conference is tonight at hardthingsconference.com. and that takes you to a website, and you click on the events, and you can RSVP for the event. If you RSVP for the event, I believe they send you an email notification saying, okay, the event is about to start, here's the link. But you don't have to RSVP, you can go to the link. But go to the link tonight, because tonight my wife Jennifer is sharing a great tool to help us understand ourselves, and that's always very beneficial. So I think it'll be a great presentation tonight. So you don't want to miss it tonight, Tuesday night, Hard Things Conference of guest speakers, Jennifer Hook. It should be really, really good. And let's see. Yeah, I think that's about all the announcements. So let's go into the story of Judah and Tamar. So we left, this is Genesis 38. We were in Genesis 37, where Joseph gets sold into slavery. Now we're into Genesis 38. So let's just take a look. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and made love to her, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son whose name was She conceived again and gave birth to a son, named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. So, Judah, one of the sons of Jacob, or now named Israel, goes down into Canaan, and he meets this man named Hiram. Let's see. He went and stayed with a man of Abdullah named Hira. So he met this man named Hira, and he has a daughter, and so he decides to marry her and make love to her, and she becomes pregnant. And what's interesting, let me look at this again. What's interesting is there he met a daughter. He married her, made love to her. She became pregnant. She conceived again by birth. Yeah. At this point, we don't know the name of the daughter, do we? That's interesting. So it's not about the daughter. It's about getting pregnant so you can have sons. I think that's interesting. Let's look again. So we'll start in verse 6 again. Judah got a wife of and for his firstborn, and named her, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord put him to death. So here's the story. Judah goes to Canaan, meets Hira. Hira has a daughter. We don't know the name of the daughter. He gets 3 sons from this. One of the sons is Onan. The other one is Shelah. And then the other one is So you have Onan, and Shelah. Yeah. And then Judah gets a wife for This is his son. His firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and named her Tamar. So Judah has a son and gets her a wife named Tamar. So he has 3 sons. And the oldest son, he goes, and he actually does what Grandpa Isaac or great-grandfather Abraham did. Went and got a wife. So he gets a wife. Her name is Tamar. But apparently his son, one of the 3 sons, is a wicked guy, and he dies, and the Lord puts him to death. Now that's interesting. So you have 3 sons. Judah has 3 sons. This is the lineage of Jesus. 3 sons. The first son is wicked. He's already found a wife for the son. That's Tamar. And now Tamar has no husband. She's now a widow. Now, according to the law of Canaan land and kind of what's going on at this point, for Judah to have a lineage, to carry that firstborn lineage, what should happen is that he should allow the second son then to impregnate Tamar and then have a son. And if that doesn't work, then you have the third son impregnate Tamar. If that doesn't work, then you have basically no sons, right? Or, no progeny. And this is the line of Jesus, so there needs to be a progeny. So impregnates Tamar, and then dies. Well, then what happens? Let's take a look and see. Then Judah said to Onan. Now, Onan is the second son. Let me move up here. Then Judah said to Onan, verse 8, Sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the child would not be his, so whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. Oh my goodness. So this sounds strange to our ears, I know. But basically, if Onan does, if the oldest brother, doesn't have any children, I mean, this is like, medieval England, right? If has no children, then Onan gets all the inheritance to himself. If he does have a child, though, if Onan does have a child, then all of the inheritance of Judah goes to that child, and it bypasses Onan. So Onan's like, no, wait a minute. I want all the inheritance to myself. And so every time he is with Tamar, he does not complete the act, and so she never gets pregnant. And now God's upset with that. So now we have two boys down, right? We have a daughter-in-law, the wife of who's still not pregnant yet. Dies, Onan dies, but he's still got another son. So this is going to work out well, right? It's like, let's send in the third boy to impregnate Tamar, and then we'll have some grandchildren. Except that doesn't happen that way. Instead, in verse 11, Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. So now this is fascinating. He needs to have a grandchild for the progeny, right? But instead of sending Shelah to go and impregnate Tamar, he tells Tamar to go back home. He says, go back home, and when Shelah is old enough, then we'll get you two together. Well, it basically what Judah is saying is like, I don't want to risk. The first two, it's like she's like the spider, the black widow spider, whatever. I mean, every time she gets a husband, they die, right? And so the first husband died, the second husband died. If I send in Shelah, he's gonna die too. Or Shelah, he's gonna die too. And I don't want my son to die. And so I'm gonna hold off on getting my son over to Tamar to impregnate her so that the lineage could go on. Now, this is very, very unfair to Tamar because she basically deserves to have the third son at this point come and impregnate her. And yes, it's a risk. I mean, the other two did die, but they died for reasons. The first one was an evil guy. The second one wasn't fulfilling his brotherly duty. Maybe the third one would do what's right in the sight of the Lord. But for whatever reason, Judah does not let those two get together. So now she's stuck. She's stuck at home. She has no children. She has no inheritance. And she's a widow. And when you were a widow, you had to dress as a widow. The custom was, the whole thing about being a widow is your husband's family is supposed to take care of you at this point. They're supposed to give you children. They're supposed to bring you into the tribe, all this sort of thing. And the fact that she's wearing widow's clothes and not with the family of Judah means she's really ostracized. I mean, she really is in a difficult situation. How does she have children if she's not part of the tribe? And now she's with her father, and she can't be remarried because she's already a widow. I mean, basically, it's a dead end, which is unfortunate because how do you have children to be in the lineage of Jesus if you're at a dead end? Well, you could say, well, Shelah, he could go, or Shelah, whatever his name is, yeah. He could go out and get another wife, except he can't. Because the laws were, if, once he's old enough and can start impregnating women, he has to go back and fulfill the duty with Tamar. And so that won't work. I mean, the whole situation is stuck. And it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And why isn't it going anywhere? It's because Judah thinks that Tamar is a jinx. The first two sons died. If the third son goes to Tamar, he's going to die. So why bother? And so he's separating them and making a difficult situation. And unfortunately, Tamar has to carry the brunt of this. Well, I guess the third son, Shula, has to, carry the brunt of this also. But anyway, that's kind of where we are. So let's go back to verse 12 and just see how this story continues. So Tamar went to live with her father's household. To verse 12. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. And when Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep, and his friend Hira, the Adullamite, went with him. So Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. So now Judah can't have any more children, right? Because his wife just died, and he's grieving. So he goes up to Timnah to see the sheep who are being sheared, and he went with his friend Hira. And if we'll remember, Hira was the father of his wife. So basically, his wife died unexpectedly, and now he takes his father-in-law, I guess, and they go down to Shimnah. So verse 13. When Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep," she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down in the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as a wife. So she's on to the game. It's like, he's old enough. We could do this thing. I could have children. You're just holding him back from me. And so she takes matters into her own hands. And so she goes, she takes off her widow's clothes, she covers herself with a veil, she disguises herself, and then she sits down to the entrance of Enaim. So this is interesting. Why? Well, we'll find out. Verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face, and not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." Okay, so this is hard also because we just don't have this practice anymore. But they had things called temple prostitutes, and this is all Canaanite religion stuff, which was I keep thinking that if you're going to have a religion, that's probably the easiest religion of all. So basically what happens in this religion is that you have temple prostitutes. And so this is the way the temple makes money. This is the way the priests make money. They find young ladies, they send them out in front of the temple. Guys come by, and it's a prostitution ring. And they say, yeah, you can have your way with me, but you got to make a payment for me. And so the guy's like, okay, I'll give you $50 or $100 or whatever. And then that money then goes back to the temple. And then if the prostitute has a child, well, that's easy too. You could sacrifice the child in the temple. I mean, it's hideous. It's just an absolutely hideous system. But preying on the desires of men, it's not a bad system. I mean, it's a pretty easy system to set up, right? And there are even American deviations of this kind of thing. Maybe not as bad as Canaanite religion, right? But, having multiple wives and multiple children and stuff like that. Anyway, so, they basically, this is the way they would set it up. And the temple prostitute was basically property of the temple. They would earn money. The temple would pimp them out. They would earn money. And if by chance they got pregnant, then the child is sacrificed. I mean, this is how the temple operated. And so Judah is going by the wayside. He sees a woman. He thinks that's a temple prostitute, and he's like, "Yeah, I'll do this." And so he's ready to make a deal with this prostitute, which is interesting because that's not part of the Abrahamic religion. It's not part of the covenant. Which is interesting also. You shall have no gods but me. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And yet he's going outside of that tribe. And, let's just see what happens. So, Verse 16, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you? She asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. So she's like brokering a deal here. It's like, yeah, what are you going to give me? You have nothing on you, you know? And then she says, verse 17, will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? She asked. He said, what pledge should I give you? And she said, well, your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. And after she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. So basically, here we go. Made a deal. I'll give you a goat from my flock. Well, you have no goat on you. Well, then give me your cord and your staff. So he gives her the cord and staff. So now the deal has been struck. She's now pregnant. She's pregnant from her father-in-law. And she's a pretty clever girl. So what does Judah does Judah get a goat and send it back so that he can get his cord and his staff back? Well, let's find out. Verse 20. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite, in order to get his pledge back from the woman. But he did not find her. So he asked the men who lived there, where is the shrine prostitute who is beside the road at Enaim? So he sends the goat back. I want my rod. I want my staff. I want my cord. Here's the goat. My friend, go find this woman. Get my cord and my staff back, and then I'll have a goat. So the guy goes there and to look for the temple prostitute. Where's the temple prostitute? And what happens? Well, let's see. There hasn't been any shrine prostitute here, they said. So he went back to Judah and said, I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said there hasn't been any shrine prostitute there. Oh my goodness. So now he finds out what in the world is going on. I made this deal with the temple prostitute, the shrine prostitute, and it's not there. What the heck is going on? I don't understand. What does he do? So verse 23, then Judah said, well, let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughing stock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her. So he's saying, I kept my part of the bargain. I sent the goat to make the swap, to get my stuff back. She's gone. She presented herself as a temple prostitute, but I don't want to be a laughing stock. So let's just forget the whole thing. So he forgets the whole thing, but not Tamar. 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant. And Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. So she gets pregnant. Tamar is now in her father's household. She gets pregnant. And Judah's like, you're not supposed to get pregnant unless it's from my son. And I held him back from you on purpose because I didn't want him to die. And now you're pregnant? And so by right, and this is all so foreign to us, but by right, he can have her killed because she went outside of the line of Judah to have a child, and that is not the way it was supposed to happen. And this is all on Judah. I mean, Judah is to blame for all this. He's to blame for having a son that was wicked. He was to blame for having the second son, who's probably also wicked because he doesn't fulfill his brotherly duty. The third son doesn't seem to be taking ownership of the situation and doing the right thing and arguing with his father to go and impregnate Tamar. The whole thing is messed up. And the only person in this whole story that seems to be doing anything about this is Tamar. But now she's going to be burned to death. According to the story. So let's see what happens. Verse 25. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. And she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. Dun, 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 dun. And Judah recognized them and said, now this is interesting, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah, and he did not sleep with her again. So she's about to be put to death, And she says, now, wait a minute. The person who impregnated me, here's his stuff. Let's take a look. And then Judah recognizes that the jib is up, right? The whole game is up. He should have sent his son Shelah to impregnate Tamar. He didn't do that. He's in the wrong. The older two boys are in the wrong. Everybody's in the wrong except for Tamar. Tamar took matters in her own hand and did the right thing to be able to give a son to Judah. And as soon as he realizes that this whole thing is up, instead of having her stoned, instead of saying, well, that's not my stuff, it cuts him to the heart and he realizes how wrong he was. And then he says an interesting thing. She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. So he recognizes that she's done the righteous thing. 27. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. And as she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, so this is how you have broken out. And he was named Perez, and then his brother who had the scarlet thread on his wrist came out, and he was named Zerah. And isn't it interesting? There seems to be twins in this family line of Judah, right? Because Jacob and Esau are twins, and now Zerah and Perez are twins. Of course, the first one to come out of the womb gets this little scarlet thread tied on. Okay, that's the firstborn, but he's not the first. He stuck his hand out, but he's not the first one out of the womb, which is interesting. Don't know if the lineage goes through Zerah or if it goes through Perez. I guess we could take a look and see in the lineage of Jesus which one gets this. I'll do that for tomorrow. That would be interesting. My guess is, knowing how God works, that the first one to come out of the womb is going to be the older brother, but the one that gets the blessing is the one with the scarlet. So we'll have to look that up. All right. So, and again, why is this story here? I mean, it's a strange story. Moses is telling the story of Joseph, and he interjects this story. Well, Judah is part of the lineage of Jesus, so we have to kind of track along with Judah because he ends up being the lineage of Jesus. And also, it's an interesting story. It gives us a bit of an insight into the Canaanite practices, pre-Mosaic law, about how these things were to be dealt with, and how Judah, we talk about the Lion of Judah, and Jesus is the Lion of Judah, and King David comes from the line of Judah. Everybody is from the line of Judah. Well, Judah's a schmuck. He doesn't do the right thing, but he finds a Canaanite woman who does the right thing. And so he ends up having children. He ends up having progeny, which is just remarkable. God always gets his will done. When God wants to get something done, he gets it done. Through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now Judah. And all these people were the promise to be the lineage of Jesus. And men keep trying to screw it up and muck it up by taking things in their own hands to outthink God. And God's like, no, I've got a plan. Trust me. And it's so hard for us to trust God when his plan just doesn't make any sense. His plan doesn't seem like it's ever going to be fulfilled. But when God makes a promise, he keeps his promise. And of course, the greatest promise is that through Jesus, we can be in the kingdom. I mean, that's the ultimate promise. And so, and God is a very, very faithful God. He is extremely faithful, and he keeps his promises. And that's something that we can cling to in this whole time of the coronavirus, that God clings to his promises. So I think we'll end it just a minute early today. We will meet again tomorrow, Wednesday. Thanks for joining me. We will continue the story of Joseph. This was just a little brief story about Tamar, very fascinating, but we'll close in prayer. Dear God, we thank you that you are faithful. Be with us today in this beautiful day. Fill us with your love and joy and peace. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so again, thanks for joining me today. I pray God's richest blessings to you today. Go out, enjoy it. I'll see you later. Take care. Bye.